everybody, welcome back to So You Want to Be a Dungeon Master. This is going to be part 2 in our 3-part series that we're releasing in the spirit of International Games Week this November. Again, this is part 2. If you haven't seen part 1, you can watch it before or you can watch it after. That's totally cool. And number 3 will be up next week. Again, real quick, just want to let you know that there are many ways to be a DM. These videos are not a substitute for the Dungeon Master's Guide. This is just some advice, tips, and tricks that have helped me and that I've learned from my years as a Dungeon Master. So this week's topic, we're going to be talking about planning your first session. And a couple of tips and tricks that will help you during your session that you can do beforehand. And I'm also going to let you have a look at my wonderful Dungeon Master's binder and show you some of the little tricks I use to keep myself organized and make dungeon mastering a little bit easier, because it can be overwhelming the first time you do it, especially because there are a lot of things to remember, and I guarantee you will not remember all of them. So hence my lovely little friend. Here, as you can see, he's kind of falling apart. That is because he is well loved and he is very useful. So let's go ahead and dive right into planning your first session. So when I'm planning a first session for players, in the way that it differs from your every session, which of course will be different depending on where you leave off in the session prior, your first session is really how you get your players introduced and immersed, especially if you're working with new players. This is a really important session, but it also gives you kind of the most wiggle room, and it can be really hard for a lot of new dungeon masters to decide where and how they're going to start. So there are 3 things that I like to keep in mind and to make sure that I include in my first session for my players. And that will help them both get immersed and get excited about playing, and it helps me to kind of have some framework when I'm writing and planning for my first session. So the 3 things that I like to make sure I have in my first session is 1, I want to make sure that I have an easy way for the player characters to meet one another and to be able to introduce their characters. 2, I want to make sure that I have some sort of plot hook, some sort of mystery or intrigue to get them invested in the story. And 3, I want to make sure that I've at least one small combat element, because for some players, it really is that fighting that's the most fun. For a lot of them, it's the role-playing. I'm definitely the biggest fan of role-playing when I'm in a campaign, but it's also good if you're working with new players who have never had combat before to give them a small skirmish or fight so they kind of know how it works, and then when you get into bigger battles they'll be a little bit more confident with using their spells or abilities. So I'm going to go through each of these and tell you a little bit how I do it, and that will kind of intersect with what I prepare for my binder. So the first thing I want to do is I want to make sure that I introduce them to the world and to each other. So I will pretty much always write a little introduction to the setting that I can read at the beginning of a session. This helps me a lot because then I'm not just describing stuff off of the top of my head, which even as a DM, you can get a little bit of performance anxiety doing. So it's really good to have something written down in my binder that when I'm nervous, I can just read it off and then improv or tweak things as I go on and as they start character interacting. Obviously, you can't really script out conversations, but having a little bit of a narrative to get you going always helps. So I'm going to share with you one of my first session intros that I have used in the past when I was talking about a cursed town storyline that I introduced them to. So I'll go ahead and read that to you, and I'll show you exactly how we weave in their characters introducing one another. So this is my Willow Gun introduction. So I would say to my characters after they have a seat and get going, I'd open my lovely binder and I would begin reading their introduction. You have each been journeying for weeks along small country roads, joining up and parting ways with various groups of travelers and trading caravans, and have finally arrived at the village of Willow Glen, where 3 paths meet to become the King's Road. Willow Glen is larger than many of the villages you've passed along the way, but is no means a proper city. It is a bustling little orchard town that sees a good amount of trade from caravans and woodsmen alike. However, as you near the wagon grounds at the edge of town, it is clear something is amiss. The road is nearly entirely blocked off with travelers and caravans that have come to a standstill. From the front of the crowd, you can hear an argument brewing. You're surrounded by new faces, all trying to enter the village, and among these new faces are... And here is where I would pause and go around the table just in a circle to let my players introduce their characters by describing what the other characters at the table see when they look at them. This lets your players introduce themselves in a way that makes sense for their characters, and also means that you don't have to beforehand try and memorize what everyone looks like when you were talking to them while they were making their characters. So it helps you, and it gives them a lot more autonomy as well. If you noticed in my introduction, I also began to plant that seed of my second pillar of a first session, which is the plot hook. There are many different ways to introduce your plot hook. Usually, I don't like to have the full thing in the introduction itself. I want it to be something that they can wheedle out by conversing with the different non-player characters as they go in, but I do want to give them something so that they have something to ask about and that they're not just kind of milling about your village or your setting. Another good place to have characters introduce themselves to one another is the tried and true tavern. I swear about 90% of D&D campaigns will start out in a tavern, and that is not a bad thing. One of the good things about the tavern is it's a place where pretty much all travelers will go, so it makes sense for any character that your players create to be in a tavern. It also is a good place to have people gossiping about interesting things or conflicts, and you can get local lore from the barkeep there as well. So it's a cliche, but it's a cliche for a reason. If you aren't sure where to start, taverns are always a good bet. I like to write out the little introductions like I did for Willow Glen here pretty much every time I introduce people to a new location, be that the entrance to a cave, be it a town, be it a tavern. I like to have a little bit written out, and then people can ask questions from there. Obviously, you're probably not going to think of anything. You're not going to think of everything. You're going to have to do a little bit of stuff on the fly, but this at least gives you a place to start. I also like to do these sessions, these little introductions every time I start a session, but for sequential ones, usually the thing I read out at the beginning of session will be a recap of the past session, and I'll get to that towards the end of this video. So as far as plot hooks, I like it to be a little bit of mystery. The introduction that I just read you is from a plot line about a village that believes that they are cursed, that some sort of beast comes into the village every night. Another good one is to say something's going on in the hills to the west, or perhaps there is a wanted sign, some bandits around, some criminals. Depending on what sort of story you want to tell, this is where you can really get creative and let it fly. I don't like to just sort of feed them, here's the quest. I like to give them little bits and pieces so that they can make the choices themselves without feeling like they're just being put on a track and railroaded along. So another thing that I liked about this particular storyline that I used that makes it good for a first session is by putting a time frame or a location on your goings on, it allows them to prepare for the combat, your third part, ahead of time. So for this one, this particular plot line, I had it that something comes into the village every night and the villagers end up boarding up all of their houses and they don't go out. So this still has that edge of mystery, so my players don't exactly know what they're getting themselves into, but they know where and when to plan for it, so they can decide what they want to do during the day to get ready. This works with a location as well. If you say that there have been bandits on a bridge or strange things have been happening in a cave outside of town, this lets them prepare for their combat ahead of time before getting ambushed. Now, some of the preparation I do for the combat is going to be what is inside my binder, along with my little introductions. So let's go ahead and have a look. Inside my binder, when I'm going to be preparing for a combat, instead of simply marking the pages in my monster manual, which I do just in case I need to go back to them, once I've decided what enemies they're going to be facing and how many of them, I like to copy down the enemy's statistics, the number of the enemies and any specific actions onto a separate sheet of paper. So as you can see, these are the enemies for a combat at a mining encampment. I've labeled it as such, mining encampment with the mine's enemies. And of course, I write down what they'll be fighting, in this case, a giant spider with its armor class, so I know what they have to roll to hit it, max HP that it starts with, and then I leave a space for current HP. As you can see, it's written here in pencil. The X's mean that they have been defeated, because this is from a party that's already happened. I put in the parentheses the number 3, because that's how many giant spiders I want. I put also the relevant skills that they would need, and I have their actions here that they can use. I also have some skeletons down here, so I have all of their stats as well and their current HP available here. This allows me to directly write on like when their HP changes, because I don't want to write in my book, and it puts everything in one place, so I don't have to skip between the giant spider page and the skeleton page, which are nowhere near each other because it's alphabetically ordered. I had to pull up this one instead of the one for my Willow Glen introduction because I very recently was given these wonderful enemy cards. You by no means have to purchase them. If you want to use cards for spell cards or for enemies, you can easily just copy stuff onto index cards instead of maybe the entire sheet, which I did. I do like to do my sheets though, because it puts it all in one place and I can write on it, which I can't do for these cards. One thing that I would always have, if you are in a town or another place where there's people, always have stats for a guard and a commoner. Again, you can write these on cards yourself, or you can put them on a binder piece of paper, however you prefer to keep organized. But index cards and papers are usually how I like to do it. I like to do the charts for each location and keep them separate. But you'll always want a guard and a commoner, stats for a guard and a commoner, because you never know when your player is going to do something ridiculous in a town or start a bar fight. It happens. So always have a commoner in case your players decide to randomly attack someone or get in a brawl, and a guard for many things. Players starting fights, players breaking and entering. It's just safe to have guard stats at the ready for any session. You never know when you might need them. In addition to my enemies sheets, which I create, and guard stats, which I do like to have on a card because I don't want to copy out the guard for every single location like I do with my enemies one. So it is just a little bit easier to have a guard kind of free floating on a card. I also like to make sure that I have my rewards charted out as well, so the treasure that they would get at the end of a combat. So this is my Willow Glen Treasures and Quest Reward sheet. There are a lot of different ways that story could have went depending on who they decided to help, so I broke it down this way. If they decided to help the character in town, he would give them 70 gold and a magic item I've described here. You can pick a magic item that is listed in one of the books, listed in one of the wikis online that I'll be able to show you in our third video, or you could make one up yourself, which is what I did with this recovery flask here. The recovery flask is a magic item I created that once per day it will have a health potion in it. I specifically created this item for the group I was DMing for because they did not have any healers. So it just made sense that the apothecary character would give them a treasure item that would be very useful to them. If they ended up helping this dryad character, they would get a longbow with the spell Entangle on it. Longbows I also chose because in this campaign I had a couple of different druid characters. I actually had 2 people playing druids and 1 person playing a rogue who also used bows. So I would definitely suggest keeping your characters, your player characters in mind when you decide on the treasure. Couple things that I like to have in my DM binder at all times are a couple of reference charts. The first one I like to keep is a currency conversion chart, and this will also have, I make sure that I have examples of prices for common items at a tavern, because there are taverns everywhere, including inn stays and how much like a mug of a certain like food a mug of a drink, not the food, or a plate of food costs, which will also give me an idea of how much I should price items at. If I say, okay, well, all right, if cheese is 1 gold, then probably an enchanted dagger should not be 1 gold. That sounds a little self-explanatory, but imaginary currency, if you're not a numbers person, can kind of like go away into fog in my head, which is why it's good for me to keep the conversion chart here, because people will buy things and you will forget the amount of conversion. So for making change, this is always good. As you can see, I've just had to print out a new one. I like being able to put this in my binder in a 3-hole punch, because then I can actually pass it around. If people just bought something and they need to do the change, I can pass it to them and they can make their conversions. The other thing that I like to keep, just for myself and not as much for my players, is a list of at how much experience players level up. That I just keep for me, so I know when I need to prepare them to level up before the next session. So that is just a quick overview of my binder, and the last thing that you will find in there, along with like charts of traps, which I make the same way as charts of enemies, is the session recaps. I highly, highly, highly recommend that within 24 hours after you end a session, write down what happened in that session. Write that recap, even if you think you're going to be meeting the next day, because you never really know how long it's going to be between sessions, and you forget things, they forget things. I've had players really, really like when I read the session recaps at the beginning of the next session. They like hearing their exploits recited to them as if they are legendary heroes and you are the bard. It's fun. It's fun to hear that when you did some like butt kicking, to hear a very dramatic narration of it. And it'll also remind them of what happened at last session, because last session might have been 2 weeks ago. It might have been a month ago, or it might have been 3 days ago. You might plan for it to be the next day, and then something happens and you don't meet for 2 weeks. So I would always, always, always recommend write down a recap. If you come up with any names on the fly, make sure you have places to jot it down. You might have seen I actually had at one point run out of paper and jotted down a name of a place I made up on the fly onto my resource chart. Use what you've got at hand, but I would definitely keep an amount of loose leaf paper if you decide to go the binder route like I do. Of course, there are other resources that'll be useful as well, and in our next video, I'll show you some of our web resources that I use when I'm preparing for campaigns, and I'll also show you what resources we have for DMs and players here at the library. So I will see you next time.